60 for the term, and 40 for the exam. So I suggest that we will, let's put it like that, 40 will be, 20 for the seminars altogether. So each seminar is 2 points if you participate and kind of we discuss, you know, what's going on and what we are talking about, then 2 points. And then we will write a test. The test will be also 20 points. And when we take a textbook, after we kind of, our last class will be a test on this textbook material that we managed to cover, and this test will be another, so this third time of 20 points. Altogether, you can have 60 for the term, and at the exam, if you are doing fine, then of course you will get your 40 and you will pass to the next level. Any questions? Not yet. As soon as you have any questions, you're welcome to ask. So never hesitate to contact me. If I can, I will help. If I cannot, you will have to turn to somebody else. Yeah, and every time after the lecture, you will see the PowerPoint that I showed during the lecture in your Google class. Also, what I want to say, I don't insist on your attending lectures. Now time is quite complicated, so if you kind of cannot turn up, don't kind of be heartbroken. It's not the end of the world. What I would like you to do is to participate at the seminars, either in writing or in like personally, to write the tests, all of the tests, because if you do not do these things, you will not accumulate points. In the what was I talking about? In your seminars, you will see them again in Google Class. Some assignments are marked with asterisk, so they have stars. So these are the tasks for those who failed to attend. So if, for instance, you failed to attend, you send me in Google Class the assignments in writing, but only those assignments that have this star. And they are all practical, because we all can read. Theory can be read and can be studied on your own, but well, the point of going to the university is to be able to do something by yourself, right? Some analysis by yourself. Okay, so anyway, if you have missed some information, just write in Google Class, write an email. And let's start. So I will share my screen with you, and we have the first lecture, which is about communication. So this is an introductory lecture, what we are going to talk about this term and next term as well. The first question is, what is communication? Well, this is a quite complicated and multifaceted construct or phenomenon. Therefore, there is no one unique and universal approach to this in this field. We can differentiate between actually 3 approaches. The first is behavioral and cognitive. And from the point of view of this approach, communication is a process in which participants create and share information with one another in order to reach a mutual understanding. So actually, within this particular approach, it's more about knowledge. So we kind of exchange facts, and as a result of this exchange, we understand these facts in a kind of similar way. We think that we have arrived at a certain mutual understanding. This approach relies on measurements. And it's not strange that it was developed in the USA, because it mostly draws on elections, on like political elections, presidential elections, and you can easily measure the success of people who send messages. So those politicians who win elections obviously succeeded in sending and communicating much better than their opponents. And the belief is that kind of with messages you create in brains of or in the consciousness of your audience, you deliver the correct information and you shape the public opinion, right? You change people's cognitive system, and you reach this mutual understanding of, for instance, goals that society faces and policies that can be used in order to achieve these goals. But this is not the only approach. The second approach is social and cultural, and it's not about measuring. It's more about interpreting and understanding. So within this approach, communication is a process whereby people in groups, using the tools provided by their culture, create collective representations of reality. So roughly speaking, what does this mean? It means that we are not that rational. And communication is not an exchange of some logical, rational information and facts. Rather, we kind of reproduce our cultural patterns, and we belong to a certain social group because we see the world in the way the social group teaches us to see. And we use actually the tools of our culture that may be quite culture specific. If you compare, for instance, tools developed by symbols, and here we also talk about historical figures, myths, various fairy tale characters, rituals, and many other things that are unique to a certain culture. And these tools are all used in order to shape every individual's point of view and worldview in particular. So it's not about being rational and arriving at certain conclusions. More, it is about doing the right thing. And this idea of the right thing is very subjective. What is right to eat, for instance, pork in Ukrainian culture, roughly speaking, is absolutely wrong in other cultures. What is, for instance, if we talk about various new things like sexual minorities, what is right in one culture may be absolutely unacceptable in the other. And it's not so much about rationality, it's about what is considered to be the norm, right? And the norm depends on your kind of point of reference, on your idea of the world, on your interpretation. This approach was developed in the UK and in Germany, In UK, there is the University of Birmingham, and in this university there is the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. The Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, and this approach was mainly developed by its employees, its scholars. In Germany, the focus of attention wasn't on culture, like in the UK, for instance, but more on ideology and power in media and politics. And the third approach is textual. So textual approach is closer to linguists and to philology. In this case, we are not so much interested in what communication is, but how it occurs, or rather how texts are structured. And so what techniques or what strategies are used to put this text together and to help to make this, to ensure that this text conveys a certain message. Here we talk about continental Europe, France and Denmark. The names are Michel Foucault, Roland Barthes, and actually semioticians. This approach, if we sum up the conclusion of this approach, then there are actually two conclusions. The first is that all texts created by humanity are basically the same. So as humans, we share the same cognitive tools, and we produce similar texts. Like basically they are the same. They are reproduction of one and the same model. Yet details and techniques make them specific, make them unique. You, as people who specialize in literature, probably have already been told that all fairy tales are roughly the same. Yes, they can be reduced to the same set of characters, and actually the plot is roughly the same. But but you immediately recognize, for instance, fairy tales that appeared in, for instance, Africa, in the Arab world, in Western Europe, in Ukraine, because they have some specific element or specific elements. And these elements make these texts unique, right, and recognizable. You immediately understand that this veneer is typically Mediterranean, for instance. In order to talk about communication, we must mention Norbert Wiener, who is considered to be the founder of cybernetics. He contributed a lot to understanding communication, and what was a breakthrough in his theory was the fact that he compared human communication with communicating with the human with communicating with the machine. He actually said that sending a message to a machine and to a human being follows the same kind of procedure, follows the same logic. And this logic is the pursuit of control. Just like when you, for instance, need a certain action from a machine, you push a button. And in such a way, you send a command to this gadget. In the same way, you for instance, you utter an order or a request to a human being, and this human being also kind of follows or doesn't follow your command. So, but in any way, whenever you communicate, you pursue control. You may pursue control, emotional control, or control over a person's physical actions, or control over the person's cognitive system. When you give new information, like for instance in this lecture, hopefully I will in a way exercise certain control over what you know. So you will probably reconsider some of your assumptions. You will get some new assumptions. So inevitably, when you send a certain message, a verbal message, you influence a person emotionally, physically, or cognitively. So that was his first publication, or the point of his first publication. The second publication, titled The Human Use of Human Beings, introduced the notion of feedback. So he claims that feedback is a primary evidence of communication. So if there is no feedback, there is no communication. Feedback may be positive or negative. You may achieve what you want, you may fail, you may get, for instance, a rejection, but whatever. If the feedback is negative, it means that you have used a wrong strategy. But if there is feedback, it means that communication has taken place. And this is the first evidence for communication. And so these are this is the background for communication studies and for scientific approach to communication. Yet, if we come to think about communication as a field of research, as kind of a source of material, you will see that the bulk of episodes is great. Yes, so how can we study it? We need to classify the material, otherwise it is a mess, and you get lost where to start from. Therefore, as a rule, communication studies divide the material according to the participants and settings. So the first area in communication studies is interpersonal communication. So in this case, we have two individuals or a small group that exchange messages with each other. Like stereotypically, we think of face-to-face communication, but nowadays it may be mediated by a gadget or Zoom. Yet, still we communicate interpersonally, right? The features of this type of communication are assumed values and shared meanings. When you communicate interpersonally, you kind of, as individuals, try to understand this particular person, and you try to kind of to understand his or her values, worldview, and you usually assume that they are more or less similar. You try to find something that can bring you together and enable you to communicate. If there is nothing in common, then obviously you don't have much prospects in communication. Then interpersonal communication also involves nonverbal and paralinguistic codes. They are very important. That's why in social media we have emojis. And yes, it depends on a particular individual whether this individual uses or doesn't use emojis. women tend to use more, men tend to kind of be very economical with them. But anyway, obviously there is this need to express emotions not only with the help of, for instance, capitalization or punctuation, but also these facial expressions. Another thing is cultural and personal meanings attributed to identity. When you communicate interpersonally, inevitably, depending on your culture, it is kind of important for you to present yourself as, for instance, a person of a certain social background, or there are certain gender restrictions, or I don't know, yeah, usually restrictions of gender matters, age, religious beliefs, and so on. Inevitably, in interpersonal communication, we try to position ourselves as personalities. When you communicate on the level of, for instance, organization, when you just you are just a function in a certain corporate structure, then you play a role. You just play a role, for instance, of a nice shop assistant, of a clever professor, and so on. But in communication face-to-face or interpersonal, it's not only what you know, or whether what you know as a, for instance, as a scientist or as a shop assistant who sells something. In interpersonal communication, you present yourself as a human being, first of all, with all the idiosyncrasies, for instance. Then the second field is group communication. I said that interpersonal communication is communication between two or people or a small group. Still, group communication takes place when people who interact have this feeling of belonging. It means that quite often it is about sharing a hobby, religion, some other interests, political, for instance, beliefs, and so on. So you know that you communicate with people who create the group where you feel you belong. And correspondingly, if you have this feeling of belonging, then it leads to the appearance of collective identity. So you know that these are kind of our people, and since there is my circle, those who don't belong to this circle, they are maybe just outsiders. But if we talk about politics, these are, for instance, allies or enemies. And here we can, as I said, these groups may be created on a quite ridiculous ground, for instance, dog owners or cat owners, but these may as well be political parties, and you can see that if people belong to or support a certain political party, then it's not like their confrontation has dire consequences. And of course, if you belong to a certain group, you share not only allies and enemies, but also goals, values, lifestyles. For instance, if you belong to some religious group, then inevitably you have certain holidays, you have certain rituals, you probably avoid certain foods, you avoid certain places, you avoid certain topics, and so on. So only in this, so group is understood in this way, not just random collection of people, but people who feel that they belong to each other, like they belong to the same community. Then the third field is intercultural communication or cross-cultural communication. These terms are used interchangeably. Here we talk about ethnic groups, not any groups of cat owners or dog owners, but ethnic groups. And here the settings may be of those of kind of equality, when, for instance, people from different ethnic groups come to a conference, and there are, for instance, a couple from each group, and none of the groups is dominant. But also there are multicultural societies where one group dominates and others make up minorities. So the settings may be different. And this type of communication is marked by a peculiar use of language, because when people from different ethnic groups communicate, they may use, for instance, they may both use a foreign language, like we speak English to people from, say, Zimbabwe, because we don't share any other language. So we speak a language that is foreign to both of us. Or we can, one of people may speak their native language and others foreign. In both cases, there are problems that arise. Then degrees of formality and politeness. Since we communicate across cultures, in different cultures, politeness is expressed differently if the politeness is universal differently. And there are different kind of different scales of politeness. For instance, in our case, most European languages, what do we have? We have a formal style, which is polite, neutral, which is kind of really neutral, and informal. But in other cultures, for example, there may be, like in, for instance, Indonesia. In Indonesian, there are 5 registers of politeness. And all these registers are expressed morphologically, meaning that you add certain suffixes to words that mark your degree of politeness, which is actually kind of puzzling for us, because, well, it's difficult to understand, to imagine these 5 ranges of being nice to people. And the third feature is values and worldviews. So what is important for people? What are the things that they will not agree to compromise? For instance, or even the use of words. For instance, when we talk about lying, what do we call a lie? As a rule, we call a lie a situation when you, for instance, promised something, and while promising, you knew that you wouldn't do this. In this case, we say that you lied to me, you're a liar. But in some languages, a person, the intention doesn't matter. What matters is what happened in the reality. So they call a liar even a person who promised to do something, wanted to do this, was going to do this, but failed because of an illness, for instance. But in these people's point of view, from these people's point of view, still this person is a liar. It was a lie, which is very strange. Well, it's strange for us, but it is even stranger for example, speakers of Arabic, who actually can lie just to make you feel happy for some time at least. Yes, this lie may lead to problems later on. For instance, they may give you directions, though they don't know the way to this place that you need. But still, to make you feel happy, they describe you in detail how to go there, just because they want to be polite. Yeah, it's actually about being polite as well. So they cannot say no, it's rude. And the fourth field of communication studies is professional, business, or corporate communication. So professional communication studies ways in which members of an organization interact with each other. So within, how people communicate within a certain organization, how employees communicate with clients, and how organizations communicate with each other. So actually there are like 3 settings, right? So within the company, with clients, with outsiders, and like business to business, right, setting. And in this case, within this communication, we talk about hierarchy, so how complicated the structure is and how it influences communication, how roles are allocated, how language is used in terms of politeness, and also whether there is some jargon. As a rule, most companies develop a certain jargon that the employees learn when they work for some time. Dress code. Then who is a manager, how a good manager is expected to communicate, what role, what strategies are the right ones. Like, for instance, я начальник, ты дурак, ты начальник, я дурак. Or, for instance, the manager's task is to help, to kind of to delegate duties, and to give you the tasks that are adequate and that are interesting for you, and to show appreciation if you have completed the assignment. We will talk about all these managerial styles, and we will discuss it. And quite often it doesn't depend on personalities. It depends on the corporate policy. So it is all kind of enforced, and it can be changed if top management wishes to change this. And also the image that the company projects onto the world. And in this case, we talk about conscious choice of slogans, mottos, logos the company adopts, and so on. So these PR activities of a company. And the last type of communication, which actually combines all of these. Yes, mass communication, if we speak about the internet, about TV, then there you can find intercultural, you can find interpersonal, corporate, group communication. So in texts produced within mass communication, you can find all the fields, but still mass communication has specific features. First, it is defined as communication of the few to the many. And in this case, yes, we talk about such a specificity as in order to be involved and to kind of control mass communication, you need to have equipment. Yeah, so this equipment is quite costly. So you also, since this equipment is owned, somebody has invested money, this somebody influences the product, because this somebody, as we see, for instance, as we saw before the war in Ukraine, owners of media companies usually had, like, they actually earned from other businesses, but they used their media holdings in order to propagate certain ideas, support certain political and economic trends and policies. So here we have like technology, which is complicated, costly, develops quite fast, and you need to catch up in order to be competitive in this market. Ownership, that is people who pay for all this costly equipment, and also regulation from the state. So though you have this equipment, still you cannot broadcast whatever you want. You must stay within certain limits that are established by legislation. Therefore, kind of, people involved in mass communication are sandwiched between owners and the state. This is the first feature. The second feature is audience analysis. Still, since broadcasts are aimed at the many, and these many must are expected to be interested and to kind of buy this product, you need to understand what they are ready to buy and how much they are ready to pay. So, and this requires audience analysis. So this requires sociological surveys, opinion polls, etc., in order to be able to understand whether this mass media product will be sold. And the third feature is the so-called synergy. I have mentioned it already. So media holdings are not the only business that owners have, and quite often they kind of help to earn even more from other businesses. This is in Ukraine. For instance, if we talk about another example, say if we talk about Walt Disney Company, then they are not only involved in making movies, but also they have, for instance, textile industry and stationery industry, and you can see that, for instance, once a certain cartoon, say Rapunzel, was released, there are immediately books, comics, stationery with the characters of the cartoon, etc. So instead of just getting proceeds from tickets bought by moviegoers, the company also earns from accompanying products, and this is called synergies. That is the merge of several industries under one management. So with this term, we will speak about interpersonal mass communication and corporate communication, step by step. But before we start studying something in particular, let's clarify the terms. So any study, any field of research makes use of terms. So the first term to be used is text. A text is kind of everything in communication studies. So anything can be a text, but if this anything produces meaning and consists of certain components. I can give you, so a text is a monument, a sentence, a novel, But also, for instance, a letter can be a text. For instance, the letter M, if you think of M as a symbol of McDonald's, and M as a symbol of Kiev underground. They are recognizable, they make sense. What are the components? How do you differentiate between these two M's?
The color and the shape of the very letter.
Yes, but if you show these letters to people who don't know anything about McDonald's or Kiev underground, then in this case, for these people, these letters do not mean anything. The same, you take, for instance, any letter from the script that you don't know, say from Arabic, you may recognize that this may be an Arabic letter. But again, this is the only thing that you can say, and you may be wrong. For instance, it may be just a stylization of certain kind of shape that looks like. Therefore, you can see that kind of all these actually, and many things that we don't think of texts are texts if we use as criteria meaningfulness and structure. Then the next is model. The next term is model. Model is a simplified description of the main elements that make up an aspect of the world. What is important? A model is not the reality. A model is always simplified. You overlook many things in the model, many things of the real world in the model. For instance, can give you an example from linguistics. We have a phonetic model of the English language, a lexical model, a syntactic model, a morphological model, complex sentences, simple sentences, parts of sentences, subject, predicate, etc., nouns, verbs. These are all models, but they are not the language itself, right? So you cannot say that, for instance, a syntactic model is the English language. No, it's just one aspect and very much simplified. But if we kind of put all these models together, then we get kind of the English of English language. Then the next term is method. We will be speaking about the method on Friday. Methods on Friday. So now I will just say that a method is a systematic procedure that you follow in order to collect and organize information. And you follow it in order to answer some questions or to test a hypothesis. So depending on the hypothesis or depending on the questions, you choose a certain method. Then medium. In communication studies, medium is extremely important. So medium is the means through which a message is communicated from source to an audience. And medium, this term is used also interchangeably with the word channel. So actually these two are, well, they stand for the same thing. Media can be differentiated and they are divided into natural, that is gestures, facial expressions, like language, touching, smells are also media. Then artifactual, and here we talk about objects, some material world, like books, paintings, carvings, architecture, etc. And electronic media, telephones, television, computers, and so on. Depending on the medium, a certain message, a certain text may be perceived as, for instance, trustworthy or not. If you read about, for instance, the use of coffee on Facebook or on Instagram, kind of. But if you read the similar information or this information in some medical journal, your attitude will be different because the medium is different. Then the next term is message. So message is the main information content of a text. A text may be very long, very complicated. It may be 3-volume novel, but the message is expressed in, for instance, within a sentence. It may be long, but still. So when you write something, if you cannot formulate the message of your writing, just have a break and try to formulate. And this ability to express a message must be applied to any any chunk in the text, a chapter, a paragraph. So if there is no message in a paragraph, means that this paragraph doesn't make sense. Whenever you write, you should keep in mind this idea of the message. Then the next is representation. Representation is a pattern or design that describes or stands for something else. Situation, event, feeling, person, etc. For instance, a cross may stand for Christianity. It kind of represents Christianity. It's not the real thing. Words are representational. Language is representational. The only cases when language is referential, when language points at a certain particular object, is with proper nouns. When you say Paris, you know exactly what kind of place, what location you talk about. But honestly, Paris may, or just like the White House, for instance, may be representational when you talk about the government. The White House meaning the US administration. In this case, it's not the building. It stands, yes, it represents the government. And the last term is a code. A code is a set of signs that are organized into a system. So we have language code, words that are organized into a system. A code may be nonverbal, it may be clothes, it may be gestures, body movements, and in this case, these are culture-specific things. The same gesture may be interpreted in different ways. Also, it relates to clothes. Yes, clothes may also be deliver, or some accessories. For instance, a wedding ring is worn on different hands in different cultures, and so there are in some cultures there are absolutely other ways of that signal that a woman is married or single. So and whenever we whenever we face somebody, we kind of communicate with our facial expression, words, gestures. We encode certain messages consciously or unconsciously, and our partners in communication decode these messages. So these are the terms. Today we are going to talk about models of communication, because, okay, we kind of know more or less what communication is, what are the components, how does it occur. how do people create these representations of reality, and how do they exchange information? Where do they use all these textual techniques? So the first attempts to build models were made after the Second World War for two reasons. The first reason was understanding that, for instance, that the Second World War was the result of successful mass communication in Nazi Germany, when when it became possible to like program people, to citizens, to act in a certain way and to support certain ideology. It became clear that if people are ideologized, they actually, it's not necessary to control them very much, because they do, and to force them to do anything, because they do on their own will. If the ideology requires this. So the main point is to enforce the ideology. So this was the first reason. The second reason was the advance of mass media. Gradually, well, the radio was widespread and TV started to appear and to spread as well. So the mass media at that time was something absolutely new, and it was necessary to understand how it works. For this purpose, there should be some model. The first model was suggested by Harold Lasswell, and it can be formulated in the form of questions. So here we have who, that stands for the addresser, for the speaker, says what, that is message, in which channel, to whom, that is addressee or hearer, and with what effect. Actually, all the main components are mentioned in this model. Everything is nice and neat. This is a one-way model. It represents communication as if somebody says something, and this something is automatically goes to the addressee and is interpreted without any problems and in the most desirable way, in the intended way. The next model, a little bit later, a year later, was put forward by Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver. These were mathematicians who worked for the telephone company, the Bell Telephone Company, and they suggested their model for telephone communication, which is also one way. As you can see, all the arrows point to the right, so there is no feedback anticipated in this model. And here what we have, so information source is the speaker, the person who calls, who says something, that is sends a message to a telephone, his own telephone. This telephone transforms this message, these words, into a signal, and the signal is delivered through the channel. The recipient's telephone is the receiver. So it gets this signal and transforms into a message that reaches the hearer. Everything is nice. The new thing that was introduced is the notion of noise. Noise, of course, for people from the telephone company, noise was bad connection or some electric failure, etc. This was an innovation in communication theory, and later on we will see how it was developed. Then George Gerbner in 1956 offered the first kind of attempt at a two-way model. That is the assumption that it's not only, communication is not only about sending, but also about reacting. So it's kind of circular. So his model is verbalized in the following way. Someone perceives an event and reacts in a situation through some means to make available materials in some form and context, conveying content with some consequence. What is important here is this perceives an event. We never start communication, or we never kind of participate in communication without any stimulus. We always react to something. We may react by our partner's words, or we may react to, for instance, to what happened yesterday between you and this partner, or between some third party. But inevitably, communication is not just an isolated fact. It occurs in some continuum, and this kind of and this communication is fluid. And as linguists, we cannot overlook Roman Jakobson's model and its layers. So the first layer is familiar to everybody, and according to this model, the addressor sends a message in a certain code through a certain medium in a certain context to the addressee. So again, all the components are familiar, we have talked about them. But Roman Jakobson also related these components to the functions of language. He claimed that language has an emotive function. And in this case, if for texts that draw on emotive function are speaker-centered, so they are about the speaker. And the classical example in this case is romantic poetry or love poetry. It's all about the author's feelings, emotions, sufferings, joys, and so on, impressions. So this is the example of the emotive function performed by language. Then the opposite to it is conative function. This is the function of a language to be hero-centered. Manuals, instructions are hero-centered. They are designed in such a way to optimize the perception. Then referential function. It's the relation between a message and the world, the real world, science, right? So language used in scientific texts is referential, logical, unemotional, objective. Then poetic function. Poetic function is represented in fiction. In fiction, writers create their own reality. The best examples are fantasy novels and science fiction. So everything is made up. Everything exists only in this particular book. This is not the real world. So poetic function. Then phatic function, the relationship between the addresser, contact, and the addressee. Phatic function is kind of checked whether there is this function when you ask, did you get it? Do you follow me? Do you understand? Are you with me? Right? So you kind of check whether people to whom you speak are still kind of listening, are still engaged. And metalingual function, that is the ability, kind of the feature of the text, of the language to deliver meanings. Metalingual means that you give the same meanings to words. I gave you an example that the word lie may be interpreted in different ways, may mean different things in different cultures. So before you argue over something with your partner, make sure that you understand this word in the same way, because quite often people just use the same words for different things, or vice versa, speak about the same thing but use different words. Therefore, this metalingual function is expressed in such phrases as, when I say, for instance, democracy, I mean. I interpret something as, right? The last model, transactional model, is what we know of communication today. It is a two-way model. You can see that here we have a communicator 1 and communicator B. A and B. They do not exist in isolation. They are in their environment, in their educational environment, their social, cultural, religious, ideological, and so on. So you do not actually communicate with a person as this person is, but with all this kind of huge amount of information and psychological content. And what happens in communication? In communication, we do not kind of take turns. At first I encode, and then you decode, and then you encode and I decode. No, in communication, we encode and decode simultaneously. So when I speak to you, yes, you decode, you listen to my speech, but at the same time, you already you shape your reaction. You, for instance, you have this inner speech, whether you agree or disagree. You may also formulate your response to my words, and I can see this through your facial expression. Also, when I encode, when I speak to you, especially in person, not to black squares in Zoom, but when I speak to a real person, I also watch nonverbal response. And if I see that the person, for instance, disagrees, I may add I decode this. Yes, while talking, I decode your nonverbals, and I may change what I want to say, or how I want to say, etc. So we cannot separate encoding and decoding in communication. Each of us does these things simultaneously. And there are numerous noises. And we will talk about noise now when we talk about miscommunication. So miscommunication is not receiving the message the way it was intended by the sender. That is, we think that we understood, but we didn't, or we understood it in a different way. The speaker wanted to say something different from what we got. And this leads to message distortion. Message distortion results from noise. There are, again, and we return to this noise suggested by Shannon and Weaver. So noise may be contextual. And in this case, we talk about, for instance, noise, like noise in the room or in the street. You cannot hear properly because of this external noise. Or, for instance, if we study offline, you may, for instance, sit far away from the lecturer and you cannot hear because of this distance. So in this case, you may distort certain, or you may fail to hear something, and that's why there is miscommunication. You have to distort. Then technical noise. This is the noise talked about by Shannon and Weaver. meaning that there may be bad line, there may be bad connection, there may be a different format. I sent you a file and your computer cannot read it, you cannot open it. This is technical noise. Then perceptual noise. That is, it can be psychological or physiological. So never speak about important things to people who are extremely happy or extremely miserable and depressed. In either states, people are not adequate. They are likely to distort what, if even notice what you say. And physiological noise may be fatigue, maybe intoxication, and so on. So again, when people are drunk, they quite often distort things. And cognitive factors. People may speak different languages. This is cognitive noise. This creates cognitive noise. Or they may stick to different ideologies. If people stick to different ideologies, then they use words differently. What is justice for instance, a person who sticks to capitalism, and what is justice for a communist? These are two different things, and you will never, you will always miscommunicate when you use this term, because they understand these words differently. What is important? The first thing to know about message distortion is that this noise these types of noise are not exclusive, mutually exclusive. For instance, it may be noisy in the room. There may be, for instance, bad telephone line. Your partner in telephone communication may be unhappy and drunk, and you may speak different accents. So the more types of noise there are, the more likely you will miscommunicate. So this is one thing. And the second thing, whatever we hear, we try to interpret, even if it doesn't make sense. So if we hear something nonsensical, we use strategies to compensate, to try to make sense of what we hear, even though it sounds illogical. So what can we do in order to explain these illogical things? We can add some details. We can assimilate, that is, we may distort something in order to make it sound logical. We can change details, so we can shift emphasis, and this is changing. We can drop some things because they are absolutely stupid, it doesn't agree with our idea of the world, so we pretend it doesn't exist. Now we can sharpen, that is, we can, for instance, make some point particularly important, and in such a way things seem to be more or less acceptable. If you are a sender, so if you want to be understood correctly by your partner in communication, then what you should do to avoid noise, to reduce it rather, to control the amount of the information in the message. If you speak in simple sentences. Don't read text that you wrote because they are difficult to process when you don't have access to the written text. Or when you write, break down your text into paragraphs, into chapters, because it gives like orderliness to the text, and it helps readers to kind of to see the structure, to see the logic. Then control serial transmission. If you need to say something to somebody, make sure that you will not use any mediators. The more people are involved in passing on the message, the more likely they will distort. Encourage similarity between communicators. So use the appropriate language. If you talk to a child, try to use the words and the sentence structure that this child can process. And vice versa, if you talk to people about, especially if you're a politician, speak to people about things that they are really interested in. And be receptive to the feedback. If you see that people do not understand or do not follow, you should do something in order to to bring back their attention, or to make things reformulate in order to be more intelligible. And if we talk about another cause for miscommunication, then this cause is information overload. When there is too much information to process, our human brain tries to cope with this load of information to a certain point. And when there is too much, it stops. So, when we find ourselves in this situation, we actually again apply some methods that may be effective or ineffective. Reactive methods are ineffective. They are very similar to compensating for message distortion. So for the noise, for example, it is leveling. Yes, you just drop some information because there is too much. So why should we care about, for instance, this particular chapters or these particular terms? Let's leave them. You may assimilate. You may queue. For instance, you do not try to see the hierarchy of importance. What is the most important? What is just the consequences of this most important assumption? You just order things first come, first served. You develop arbitrary rules. For instance, you receive a long list of literature, you read the first two. Or you read, for instance, the shortest publications, or you read the 5 latest publications. And that's it. These rules are absolutely arbitrary, they are not rational. Or you escape. You may close the book and go to sleep. You may, I don't know, leave the room. You may drop out. You may leave your job, and so on. So these methods do not produce positive results. There are proactive methods, how to cope with information overload. You chunk information, you break it down into parts and consider each part separately. This is how we, for instance, remember telephone digits. We group them. If we need to remember something, we group them. So the same with when you have to take into account a lot of things, you just break them into paragraphs, chapters, and so on. The second one is to filter. You try to understand what is the most important. You set your priorities, and if it is necessary, you go into details. If it is not, you have the general idea, and this general idea is enough for you to understand, for instance, the theory. If you need more details, you dig deeper. If you don't, then you still consider this theory covered and processed. So this is it for today. If you have any questions. No questions. So as we agreed, we will meet on Friday. There will be the second lecture. Today you will get this first lecture and the first seminar, and on Friday you will get the second lecture and the second seminar after our class. Okay? Okay. So thank you for attending. I wish you to have good evening after all the classes, and see you on Friday. Take care of yourselves.
See you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.